everybody. I'm Bill Van Riper, Research Librarian at the Martha's Vineyard Museum, and this is another installment of Treasures from the Martha's Vineyard Museum Archives. And I'd like to start today by showing you something that most of us have never thought about, which is how you get ice delivered to your house and paid for. This is a book of coupons dating back to the day when nobody had electric refrigerators and an ice box was actually a box with a gigantic block of ice on the top that kept your food cold. The ice, of course, was delivered by an iceman who, as Eugene O'Neill would remind us, cometh periodically. And these coupon books were issued by one of the Vineyard's ice companies. The idea was that when the iceman came to call, you told him you wanted such and such many pounds of ice, and then you pulled a 25-pound coupon or a 10-pound coupon or a 5-pound coupon or whatever the appropriate number of coupons to cover the amount of ice you were getting out of the book and gave them to the iceman. When the book was empty of coupons, you went down to the ice company and paid for a new book. The idea being that the iceman was already dragging 25-pound blocks of ice up your steps and into your ice box, didn't have to worry about carrying money around, making change, or keeping records. All he had to do was accept the coupons and take them back to the front office at the end of his daily route. Ice boxes, iceman, ice tongs, and all the other paraphernalia keeping food cold in the days before electricity have pretty much passed into history. But you can find them and a great many other traces of life as it used to be lived on the vineyard in the museum's archives. What do you do if you're a 19th century tourist and you visited the vineyard and you want to bring home pictures of all the amazing things you saw? But cameras are large and clumsy, impossible to carry around in your pocket, and difficult to use if you're not a professional photographer. This was the niche that view books like this one were created in the last quarter of the 19th century to fulfill. A view book was a series of perhaps 40 or 50 pages worth of beautifully framed, beautifully produced images taken with big glass plate cameras by professional photographers and professionally printed on glossy paper. They were sold in souvenir shops at the Vineyard and other places, so that if you wanted images of your vacation to take home with you, you could purchase one at a reasonable price and have something to hand around to your friends when you were telling them about the vacation afterwards. This is a boat like the one we went to Martha's Vineyard on. This is the church we went to on Sunday. This is the beach where we went swimming in our wool bathing suits and wondered why nobody had invented something that dried quicker between uses. View books largely went out of fashion by the beginning of World War I as more portable cameras became available. And now, of course, everybody carries a camera around in their pocket and makes phone calls on it when they're not shooting vacation pictures. But 19th century view books in the Martha's Vineyard Museum's tourism collection provide a window on what people thought, or what photographers thought people thought, they would want to show the folks back home after a vacation on Martha's Vineyard. There have been any number of advertising campaigns to get people to come to Martha's Vineyard for the summer, but one of the more famous from the years between the World Wars promoted Martha's Vineyard as the Isle of Health. The various versions of this advertising campaign, which was carried out through pamphlets and flyers and newspaper advertisements and whatnot, all reinforced the idea that if you came to the vineyard, you could find cool, healing breezes, wide open spaces, and an abundance of healthy food. One of the talking points that the brochures came back to again and again was that every cow on the island had been inspected and certified as disease-free. And if that wouldn't make you want to come to Martha's Vineyard, I don't know what would. The Isle of Health campaign more or less ran its course by the end of the 1930s. But it feels oddly resonant today as news reports say that Dukes County has one of the lowest COVID-19 infection rates in the country. So maybe it's not the well-inspected cows, maybe it's not the cooling ocean breezes, but perhaps there is something to the whole island health thing after all. So how do you get to Martha's Vineyard? Nowadays, and pretty much ever since the end of the Second World War, the answer has been, for most people, you drive, or for a small number, you fly. But before World War II, the answer was very different. If you were coming from New York and points south, chances were you made your way to Manhattan and boarded one of the overnight steamers of the Fall River Line, which ran multi-decked steamships up Long Island Sound, up Block Island Sound, to New Bedford and Fall River, where you could then transfer to the New England Steamship Company boats that ran to Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. Or, if you wanted to come by land, you could travel by the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad, which would take you again from Greater New York up the coast to New Bedford, where you could transfer to the New England Steamship Company on your way to Vineyard Haven, Oak Bluffs, or until 1930 or so, Edgartown. The piece of the story that tends to be forgotten nowadays in the age of driving and superhighways is that the New England Steamship Company and the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad and the Fall River Overnight Boat Line were all ultimately, by the end of the 1930s, owned by the same corporation. It was part of a gigantic integrated transportation network that also included motor coaches to transfer you between Fall River and New Bedford, or to take you from New Bedford to points north like Boston. The end of the Second World War, the beginnings of modern highways in southern New England, and the shift from rail and boat travel to road travel spelled the end of the integrated travel experience that involved, well, boats, trains, and the occasional automobile. But many now alive can still remember as children taking the night boat, taking the train, and the excitement of walking across the New Bedford docks, realizing that they were about to embark on that last leg of their long, multi-stage journey to Martha's Vineyard. There is in the Martha's Vineyard Museum archives a collection with the unsuggestive name of Writings Collection, which is where we put all those historic documents that are somebody writing about the vineyard but that don't really fit in any other particular thematic place. And one of the items in that collection is Farewell to the Vineyard, which is a multi-verse poem printed on a very old, very low grade of paper, which suggests that it might be from the first quarter or third of the 19th century. My vineyard friends, I bid adieu, it begins. I must depart and leave your isle, perhaps no more to meet with you, to share your joys and heavenly smile. Whatever this guy's day job was, it probably wasn't writing poetry. He's not going to give Wordsworth or Longfellow a run for his money. But the wording is suggestive. It's somebody, he's writing with the voice of somebody who's leaving not just to go to do business on the mainland, not just to go away for the winter and come back next summer, but perhaps forever. All of which, in combination with the name of the author, Elder J. Adams, raises an intriguing possibility. John Adams, he was known in his own day as Reformation John Adams, was an evangelical Methodist preacher who rode the circuits of New England spreading the faith and holding fiery revival meetings involving copious references to hellfire, brimstone, and eternal damnation. He was responsible, probably more than any other single individual, for the spread of Methodism on the island in the late 18-teens and early 1820s. And the image of him that comes down to us from writings about his ministry suggests an intense, humorless, fiery-eyed, single-minded person. And yet, the look and feel of the paper and the tone of the poem and the references to God and perhaps meeting the listeners in the hereafter suggests that maybe, just maybe, the elder J. Adams of this poster, this handbill, is in fact Reformation John Adams, the circuit-riding hellfire preacher who changed the religious history of the Vineyard forever. We may never know for sure, but mysteries like these abound, and they're fascinating to think about. About 20 years ago, the Bass and Bluefish Derby Committee gave the Martha's Vineyard Museum an enormous collection of photographs, artifacts, t-shirts, and other memorabilia from the history of the Derby. This is one of the more than 1,000 photographs in this collection. A woman wearing a pair of waist-high waders and a knit cap, holding up a fish in one hand, a fly rod in the other, somewhere on the vineyard, in some derby, sometime, probably in the 70s or 80s. I've looked through the derby photos countless times for exhibits, for social media posts, for various other things, and this is one of the images that I keep coming back to. Both because there's something about her expression, the sort of casual, well, yes, I stand up to my waist in freezing cold surf, casting a line out there, hoping to pull in a fish that's bigger than anybody's gotten that day. Yes, this is my idea of fun. And in part because, unlike a lot of the people pictured in the Derby collection photographs, we don't know her name. Now, in the grand scheme of history, that's a small thing. There are lots of people and lots of pictures in the archives whose name we don't know because nobody thought to write it on the back of the picture at the time, and everybody you might have known is now gone. But every so often you get one and you look at it and you think, this person could still be alive. People who knew this person could still be alive. Somebody out there probably knows her name. So if that somebody's you, give me a call in the Martha's Vineyard Museum Library because I'd really love to know who she is. And also, public service announcement, write the names of the people on the backs of your pictures, folks. You know who they are, but someday, maybe, some museum librarian will sing your praises and say your name with reverence. Thanks a lot. When we think of the vineyard economy, we think of fishing and farming, and then eventually, beginning after the Civil War, tourism. But as Janet Van Tassel pointed out in a master's thesis she wrote back in the 1970s, drawing in part on material from the museum archives, industry was also part of the history of the vineyard. That in that brief period in the mid-19th century when the vineyard had its own industrial boom, included the brickworks at Roaring Brook and Chilmark, now open as conservation land, the Satinet Mill in downtown West Tisbury that now houses the Garden Club, and an extinct shoe factory in Edgartown, of which the only surviving trace is some business records in our archives. And then there was the Kaolin Products Company at McConaughey on the West Tisbury border, which flourished for a brief shining moment towards the end of the 19th century. The entire north shore of the vineyard is rich with clay deposits, not just at Gay Head, although most famously there, but also at Roaring Brook and as far north as the edge of McConaughey. It was scraped into place 20,000 years ago by the advance of the glaciers, and any number of businessmen looked at it and saw a potential source of profit. This brochure, which we were recently given by a kind donor who found it in a drawer in their house, was designed to attract investors to the Kaolin Products Company. It touted the extensive and rich deposits of that particular type of clay, its uses in ceramics, in fire brick, in ordinary brick, and other saleable products, and the fact that the founders of the company had already built a 500-foot wharf, a brick-making plant with a capacity of 8,000 bricks a day, and even a steam railroad, the locomotive of which was pictured in the brochure, that was designed to haul clay from the deposits where it was being dug to the end of the wharf where it could be loaded on schooners and sent to buyers on the mainland. The Kaolin Products Company never took off. The planned expansion of the plant to 100,000 bricks never materialized. And nobody, or almost nobody, now remembers that there was even a brickworks there on the shores of Lambert's Cove Beach, where people now walk dogs and sun themselves and look across the sound and think how nice it is to be spending time on an island where the Industrial Revolution never seemed to reach. It did, actually, and not really so far away. Writing about Martha's Vineyard in periodicals, newspapers, magazines, and whatnot is a time-honored tradition that goes back at least to the 1840s. We've got original editions and copies of dozens and dozens, possibly hundreds when you add them all up, of magazine articles that people have written to explain the vineyard to the world. But perhaps none is more famous and more fondly remembered than the one that ran in a 1961 issue of the National Geographic magazine. Shot over the course of the preceding spring and summer, it contained the National Geographic's trademark magnificent color photography of, for example, the Edgartown Regatta back in the days when the sails were cotton, the lines were manila, and nobody wore a life jacket even on stormy days. It pictured things like the famous dressmaker's dummy that kept watch from the Widow's Walk atop the Jared Fisher house, causing any number of double takes from tourists who wondered who the heck that was up there with a telescope. Ship model makers and doing their thing in Edgartown as people had done it for years and years gone by. Timeless shots of small children eating corn at a beach picnic. And local characters like this gentleman here, fence viewer Oscar Flanders of Chilmark, whose job it was fulfilling an office that went back to colonial days to make sure that the stone fences that separated one property from another were kept in good order. Even as this article was published in 1961, the office of fence viewer was essentially obsolete. Oscar Flanders, who was re-elected to it year after year, got it as a gesture of affection from the community where he'd grown up. I mention Oscar Flanders here because he's become, thanks to the generosity of a donor who loaned us the painting, my constant companion here in the MV Museum Library. A portrait of Oscar and his brother Robert, painted by local artist Stanley Murphy, hangs between the two front windows of the library within easy view of my desk. And I have to say, I can't think of a better person to spend my work days with than venerable Chilmark fence viewer Oscar Flanders.